Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. My name's Sarah Hunter. I'm a trustee here at the Nesta Group. And I'm delighted to be asked to introduce today's President's Lecture. We've got David, President Emeritus, I can't say that properly, and Liz, who's head of the Innovation and Partnerships team here at BIT. Before I hand over to them, I know you're all excited to hear what they're going to talk about. I just want to give a bit of context. So David and Liz are going to give us a sneak preview into their new book called Superhumans, which is going to be coming out, I think, early next year. And obviously, for those of you in the behavioural insights field, it's going to be super interesting. But I think it's probably going to have an even wider audience than that. For all of us who work in the sort of political and social policy field, there's been a lot of change in the last 10 to 15 years. Populism, polarisation, lack of trust, lots of things going on, and no one can quite work out why. But I think there's some themes in this book that are really going to resonate. There's a pollster called James Kanagasorian who has produced some research recently that suggests that agency, the extent to which we feel, I'll start again. Agency, the extent to which we feel empowered to take choices and be the masters of our own destiny, that is in decline. And actually, the sense of agency is one of those things that actually can cut across all these different social trends. It could be the thing that could turn around a lot of these negative trends we're seeing socially. So I think there's a lot in this book that's relevant to that. David and Liz are going to talk for about half an hour. Then we're going to have about 20 minutes of questions. We've got a lot of people who are joining online, so we'll take questions from there, but also please have a think about your own questions as well. Over to you two.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. In fact, we're going to flag James's work in a minute. Wonderful to be back here, as always, in BIT. For those of you who've been following closely, you might know actually that was not going to be the original title of the book. And so we'll give you a little glimpse into that about why we actually changed the title. Talk a little bit about that. But in some ways, it's kind of the intellectual amuse-bouche in terms of what's the foundational arguments for the book rather than trying to do the whole thing. So sorry to disappoint you. You're still going to have to read it later. Right. So we thought we'd just start with an old BIT study from Australia from a number of years ago, which we actually used also at the beginning of the book, which is we were doing work, some of you might remember, I think the Alex in the room, with teenagers in Australia who were wrestling with social media at the time. Still topical, it turns out. And essentially the kind of the project was kind of working with them about talking about and understanding how they were using social media. So a big thing at the time was Snapchat and the way in which Snapchat was being used, and also the sense actually of kind of almost oppression that many young people felt about the pressure to maintain their streaks. Remember, you know, the little streak, the little flame, you get going, but you got hundreds of friends, you know, and you've got to kind of maintain them, and of course you can automate some of that. But they were spending a lot of time doing this. But when they all get together, it's like, oh my God, you know, I want to do this because I don't want to let you down, you know. But then you feel the same, but you can sort of see you've got this equilibrium issue about, well, how should we use and how do we want social media to operate? At the same time, of course, as the CEO and senior figures inside Snapchat were giving evidence both to Parliament and to Congress about, oh, but that wasn't our intention to capture more of your attention, etc., or your time. So one of the points about it is that young people have some experience of they're sort of being done to. They have this sense of it, and to some extent they are being done to by the design of this technology. And the question was, hard for them individually to do it, but to what extent can they recapture that actually agency exactly to make a choice of how would they want it to be? Since that time, Australia has introduced the ban, and it's all happening in Britain too. So anyway, it was a good example, I think, to start with about what would that look like and how would you boost their capacity individually and collectively to shape that technology. So I was going to talk a bit about the agency side, and then Liz is going to go through a bit more of the sort of detailed structure of the book. So what is happening to agency? I mean, actually, when Sarah, you were introducing it to the room, people were kind of nodding, like, yeah, that's right, that's right. But if you step back from it, is that really true that you don't have agency or relative to others or your experience of it? There does seem to be something certainly in the air politically about that people feel that. But let's just have a quick look at it. Who can tell who's really old in the room, who knows what this is? You have to put your hand up. Matt's put his glasses down. Oh, what? Awesome. Yeah, this is an Atari. Wow. I can remember when I was at school, and you know, the first of my peer group who got this, Space Invaders, obviously, and 5 hours, oh my God, whatever. You know, and you have a few games, and if you're really like super upper middle class, you know, you might have 10 or 12 games that you could plug in. By the way, this is literally in a museum. This is a picture of an entire, which is kind of fascinating in its own right. That does seem a world away in lots and lots of ways. And if you look at the trends and the growth in consumer products, games would be a good example of it. So this is just assembled for a number of consumer kind of products and areas. Actually, this orange line is the, moving enough to get the cameras confused, video games, right? In fact, this will be like ping back there, like, doop, doop. And this incredible rise. So this is actually plotted logarithmically. So that's true for many areas. We can see here household appliances. Actually, automobiles look like they don't move very much, but even on that, that's kind of deceptive actually, because the number of variants, colors, product combinations is massive. That's been the real growth there. So in all these areas, and at the top, we can see entertainment, of course, is absolutely astonishing movement over time. Here's supermarket products, a smaller move, but you know, you would have, in the 1930s, you had sort of 1,000. Now your SKUs would be 100,000 in big stores. So we've definitely got a lot of choice, guys. So what's the problem? Why do you not feel you got choice? Because the very choice itself creates issues with respect to, well, how do you then handle that level of choice? There's another mega trend that sits alongside this, which is, those who haven't seen it, this is the Engelhardt Faisal World, it's from the World Value Survey. It's basically everything from the World Value Survey, and you try and make a sense of it. It's an astonishing piece of work, actually. This is the 2023 update. And how countries fall on it. And this is the kind of factor analysis, the principal components, if you like, on the 2 dimensions. And generally, economic growth and development has moved us in this way. And you sort of see each generation kind of comes in more moving along in this broadly. So this is traditional to secular values. So you move from religious and so on. Actually, the movement there has been less dramatic over time than people often aware of. It's been stickier. And this has been the real big mover, right? So if you go back before the Second World War, in fact, long before that, as far as we can tell, the dominant characteristics about everyday beliefs was fatalism. Actually, that was what people felt like. Just stuff happened to you, right? Your kid might die, your crop might fail, and so on, and it was the fault of the gods or some invading, you know, king or whatever. And you accepted that's how the world was, and it had a certain set of values around it. So you step in line, you respect authority, etc. You do your duty. These are all characteristics of fatalist beliefs, which actually were really dominant before the war, and you still see it. You track it because many of those generations now die, but you know you'd see it. The cohorts is sticky through your life. But what really happens with the boomers get choice. They don't just get literally consumer choice. They kind of buy into the idea more fundamentally. So what's happening on this axis as you move from survival to self-expression on a number of things? So classic things about personal sexual values. So acceptability of homosexuality is one of the biggest movers that we see. It was considered like, you know, terrible thing, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's really, you know, very much taken for granted. We would teach our kids previously in earlier cohorts around duty and obedience. Now it's creativity and imagination and differentiate yourself, right? So it's expressed in lots of these ways, and it comes in as a sort of layer of, in many ways, the expectation of choice. We can actually disaggregate it over time. This is, if you take the self-interest values, they're a bundle, they correlate, as it were. They actually don't all move in exactly the same way. So this is broadly the tolerance, for example, attitudes, you know, what you do in your own bedroom, that's your own business, we don't care anymore type thing for most countries. Certain kind of groups of values, belief in autonomy. Some of these other ones have moved less over time. Subjective well-being is one of the things that's also associated with happier people, which we'll come back to a second. Interestingly, trust, which is also in the bundle, trust in other people and institutions, has actually generally, because differentiation has declined, and that's unraveled a bit. Anyway, so you've got this rise in literally consumer choice, but you've also got an underpinning set of values about our expectation of choice, right? We get to choose who we will and what we believe in, and we take that for granted. Except that's starting to grind to a halt, basically. You mentioned James's work, so I actually thought it's very much UK-based, but interesting, very different source, seeing some of the same when you reanalyze some of these values, and it's too small for you to see, but there's basically control and freedom. This is kind of 2 principal components now using UK data about optimism about the future, social trust, happy, control and freedom of choice. And right over here is not in control, left behind, pessimistic, etc. I won't go through all the axes, but you can sort of see this kind of primary. One of the interesting things, if you then, as James has done, if you plot how people are voting on those 2 axes, you get a story like this, where actually your traditional parties are kind of close together, but actually as you move to well, Green Party, actually Liberal Democrats, by the way, also here, Reform and so on, they're actually on this sort of axis about a sense of control or agency. So I think it's very present, right, in lots of ways. When we, just going back one step, when we wrote the paper more than 20 years ago in the PMSU, in the Blair era, it was very much about actually changing behavior, but also with agency, co-production and so on was very much the language. And that was something we also very much had in the founding of BIT itself in 2010 to support and encourage people to make better choices for themselves. As Liz will talk about more, I mean, I think many people say we did a pretty good job with respect to supporting people to make better choices, pensions, auto-enrollment and so on and so on. But did we live up to the aspiration well enough, which was actually, did we make you a better decision maker, which is not the same, right? So great, millions more people saving, but actually are they smarter in terms of their financial choices, which is a higher bar. Another reason why the world, I think, also moved on, so this is actually from work which Liz has been involved in, about the industrialization of nudging and sludging. This is the classic but everyday example of it's very easy to sign up for platforms with one click. This is the number of clicks or steps that you have to in order to leave current platforms. And the numbers just don't, you might want to talk more about it later, but it's like, it's pretty shocking, but pretty everyday kind of what's going on. So the choice architecture is operating. The choice architecture, which we've needed because of the volume of choice, which we now have. We actually have the choice, but we need choice engines to navigate our way through it. So the puzzle really, and we're wrestling with centrally in this book, right, is this question of, well, how do you then exert agency in a world where you may feel done to? To some extent you are, because you're living in a world of choice architects who may be acting on your behalf, but may not. And yet you sort of have to have them. That's the sort of world we're in. And we're trying to move beyond, as we'll talk about in a second now, particularly the question between what's the difference then between a nudge and a so-called boost. So some of you know, there was a little bit of controversy about this, which is give you a tiny peek behind the curtain on it. But we had planned to call the book Boost, right? Because boost seems to encourage. We did wrestle with this word, and you'll know it's very linked to Ralph and Till's work. And in fact, from 2012, they have a book coming on it as well. Anyway, we were quite struck. I mean, we didn't call the team, well, it often was called the nudge unit, as colloquially, but it was the behavioral insight team because it was intending to do these things. But with respect to nudges, I mean, the great thing about nudges, they have lots of characteristics about choice architecture and so on. And there's certainly this whole area, often known as educative nudges, which is to try and, essentially inform people better so they make better choices, you might say. But there is something beyond it with respect to actually, to extent, do we lean into the actively facilitating agency, which is, I think, correctly captured with the notion of boost. I should tell you that, so we're very good friends with Gus Sonstein and Rich Taylor and so on. They definitely were a little bit concerned, let me put it diplomatically, about what you're going to call a book boost. You're going to the other side. I guess our point is we don't really see it as going to the other side. I mean, there is a deep set of questions often associated with boost, which is the extent to which people are malleable and in fact can alter the heuristics in a deep way, or to an extent it's kind of stuck. But we think there are a whole class of interventions, and it merits, against that wider backdrop and the way in which the world is changing, is that we do have to lean into this space more actively with what you call, what generally would be known as boosts. So, on that note, I'm going to hand over, I believe is the right time,
it is,
for Liz to start taking us through the next bit. Very good. All right. Okay.
Fantastic. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about actually what we do about that, and how do we, as individuals, and how do we collectively reclaim our agency and reclaim our power to choose. But more than that, how do we shape these forces that are shaping us and our behaviour? And so we thought it's a very wide-ranging book, but we thought what we'd do is give you a sense of the structure and then just one example from each of the sections to really bring it to life and give you a sense of the arguments that we're trying to make. So the book is split into 3 parts. The first part is called Human, and it's about what each of us as individuals, each of us sitting in the room, can do ourselves to strengthen our decision-making skills, to strengthen our agency, and really our ability to choose in our own best interests. And that's across, what we pay attention to, how we judge what is real versus what is not, but also how we translate our intentions into actions. Then the second half of the book, the second part of the book is called Suprahuman, And it's really about these forces above us and around us that shape our behavior in ways that sometimes we don't even realize, but in ways that are hugely powerful, and how we can actually exercise our collective agency to shape those forces in a way that they work better for us rather than, these powerful, sophisticated choice architects. And then finally, we're talking about being superhuman, and really, what does it mean to shape emerging technology, particularly AI, so that it really genuinely makes us the best that we can be, so that it enhances our cognition, it enhances our experience of the world, and really enhances human flourishing. And to what extent is that a choice in our gift? We think it is, but hopefully we'll persuade you of that across the course of today. So firstly, human, what can each of us in the room do to become better decision makers and strengthen our agency? And I want to talk firstly about attention. And any of you who have a phone in your pocket, which I would hazard to guess is all of you, might think deeply about where your attention is going and how it gets fragmented day to day. And the great psychologist William James said famously, "My experience of the world is what I agree to attend to." And really, to a great extent, our choices, our day-to-day experiences are about where we direct our attention. And because of that, attention has become the most valuable commodity in the digital economy. And in many ways, behavioural techniques and industrial levels of experimentation are used to work out how to capture our attention and how to hold it as long as possible. And I think increasingly our own goals, how we want to spend our time, what we want to achieve, how we want to be present in our lives, are at odds with the commercial incentives of the world's biggest companies who's, are really trying to keep us online with our attention focused on that as much as possible. So really the question that we're tackling in just this first chapter is how we can strengthen people's capacity to judge for themselves how to best direct their attention, and also strengthen their agency to act in line with that. So how do we do that? Well, this is one example. This is OneSec. And OneSec is an app that was developed by Ralph Hertig and a group of researchers at the Max Planck Institute and the University of Heidelberg. And it does a couple of things. So firstly, it puts you in the role of the choice architect. So if you're using OneSec, you are deciding which apps on your phone you want to spend less time on, not somebody else. It's you, it's your decision, whether that's Substack or Instagram or TikTok or Gmail or whatever it might be. For me, it's Instagram very much so. And I do use this. And so then what it does is when you go to open that app, it creates a bit of friction. So it creates a pause of about 10 seconds, asks you to take a deep breath, and it tells you how many times you've tried to open that app in a day, which sometimes is a bit confronting. And you might ask, that seems like quite a light touch intervention, and actually up against the might of these algorithms, does it actually work? And the answer is yes, it does, and it works actually amazingly well. So in the evaluations that team has done, they've seen that using OneSec reduces the time that people spend on those apps by more than 50%. And in the latest evaluation they did in Germany, those effects persisted for more than a year. And actually, this is my favourite evaluation. This was done by the Danish Competition and Consumer Authority last year, led by Katrine Norman and Andreas Malo Jespersen. And they did this with a group of 13 to 17-year-old teenagers, teenagers who didn't self-select into this, so a much better sample of people who, are not self-identifying as having issues with social media. And as you can see, from the moment that they started using OneSec, and there's a few different variations of it here, they reduced their screen time on those apps by about an hour a day. And what you can't see on here is actually for those teenagers who were really heavy users or self-identified as having low self-control, it was actually more than that. They were also sleeping more. And crucially, they didn't feel disempowered by this. They actually felt empowered, more satisfied in using social media in a more deliberate and intentional way. So you can see that, it is a relatively light touch intervention. It really works in two ways though. And one of them, as you saw on that Venn diagram, one of them is a bit nudge-like and one of them is more boost-like. So the friction and the prompt, which is more nudge-like, does cause people to say, no, I'm not going to open that app. But actually, the majority of the effect comes from people stopping trying to open the app in the first place, even when 1sec is not intervening. And so even when the intervention is taken away, people's self-regulation is strengthened. They're stopping trying to open those apps, and they're much more in control of actually how they're directing their attention and their time. I think it's interesting because actually one of the critiques of boosting is that, as Oscar Wilde said about socialism, it would just take too many evenings. And some people think, strengthening people's skills and capability and agency in this way is too costly, it's too time intensive, and it doesn't scale. And I think this is an example that shows that doesn't have to be the case, and that actually we can do this in a tech-enabled way. We can do it in a way that is light touch, effective, and does scale. And I want to show you how it can scale. So this is a very recent announcement from Google that they are going to explore rolling out something called Pause Point. And if you read the description of Pause Point, it should sound really familiar because it's basically a carbon copy of 1sec, which is, I think, a really positive thing. So, there are 4 billion Android users around the world. And if Pause Point was installed as the default on Android phones, actually, it's a boost that really puts people's attention back in their own control and in their own agency. So next, superhuman. So David and I have worked a lot over the years on systems and markets and how they shape our behaviour and also how we can shape them. And we have always had these superhuman forces shaping our behaviour, whether it's our relationships, the state, markets, institutions. But as David said, we think that landscape is shifting, particularly with tech, but also more generally, where actually there are big questions about whether sophisticated choice architects are choosing in their best interests compared to our best interests. And so this second part of the book really majors on this question of who decides what a better choice looks like and better for whom. And I think it's fair to say this is where we collegiately diverge from Ralph Hertig and Till Grunyanov. Ralph and Till are very focused on the individual level boosts. And as we talk about in the first part of the book, we think there's a lot of value in strengthening individual agency. But also we think to a large extent, day to day, the way that our agency is expressed is actually social and collective. And, that was true long before social media apps, but they have certainly strengthened that sense. And just to give you a sense of, really how far back we go here, this is a tablet from about 2,500 BC in Mesopotamia. And what you can see here is a shield wall. So this is an army invading, literally kind of, exerting agency over another community. But each of these in the shield wall, so, they're walking together with the protection of the shields. And each of them, in theory and in practice, has individual agency and personal agency. But their expression of it is literally interdependent with the other people in that shield wall. So if one of them breaks, well, they're all screwed, basically. And so this just gives you a sense of the dynamics that we're exploring in this part. And, we really do think that there are many areas we can go further and have greater impact if we're thinking and working at the collective and the systemic level, or, to put it another way, directing our choices and our agency upstream. And I want to give you a quick example, 2 quick examples of what that can look like. The first is around literacy versus legibility. So there's been many studies over the years about how to strengthen people's individual financial literacy. The meta-analysis of that is that it's pretty hard and it's not particularly effective. And particularly that's the case where people are up against markets where financial information is deliberately confusing, it's deliberately quite difficult to compare across products, and certainly difficult to compare across the market. Whereas actually we think if you move upstream and you think about how do we make the world, the financial world, more legible, actually we can help people express their agency and strengthen their capability in a much more assertive way. And we did this a few years ago with foreign exchange. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of being at an ATM in a foreign country and forgetting, should you be getting out pounds or euros or whatever it is. And it's just bloody hard to know which one you want because there's no signal to you of actually what's the right choice. But actually, most people don't exchange money at ATMs. It's done on platforms. And it's really, again, really hard to work out what the actual exchange rate is and what the fees are, and therefore to compare across the market. And in this quick experiment we did, we showed that actually, if you can remove that confusion, then you can roughly double the rate at which people are choosing the best rate on the market for them. And we think there's a lot further we can go across lots of different domains to make the world around us more legible and therefore make it easier for people to choose well. And more generally, this section of the book is about trying to escape this dynamic that David talked about of being done to, feeling done to, and really shaping systems so that they are on our side quite overtly. So I want to take us back for a minute, back to Janice and the, we didn't call her Janice, did we? Back to the teenagers in Sydney who we were working with in 2017, one of whom was Janice. And a big question then, as it is now, is actually what are the best social media platforms for teenagers or actually for any of us? And how would you choose between them? And, at that time, there was very little information. But actually, around the same time we were working in Sydney, the Royal Society for Public Health here in the UK was doing this study called Status of Mind. And they did a big survey of teenagers in the UK to understand their experiences of different social media platforms. And I think there's a few things to take from this. The first is that there's massive variation between them, right? So on the left-hand side, you can see the net impact on teenagers' mental health and well-being. And, most of them are negative, but actually YouTube is relatively better than the others. But even within the platforms themselves, there's real variation in terms of the relative impacts on things like sleep, anxiety, a sense of missing out, sense of self-expression. And we think that by giving people this kind of collective intelligence about the nature of the products in the markets that we're choosing, we can help people make different and smarter choices. And in doing so, we can also create a different kind of competitive pressure in the market. So not one that is just trying to clip the worst behavior in the market, but actually one that's trying to encourage excellence and encourage progress on the metrics that we care about, whether that's mental well-being or safety or other things. And really kind of trying to move from not only a name and shame dynamic, but also a name and fame dynamic of, really what are the best products on the market and how do we get those to grow. And Dave and I are really very bullish and optimistic that we can do more of this and this kind of de-shrouding and collective intelligence, and that it really would genuinely shape the nature of products and markets for social media, but also for a whole host of other things. So with that, our final section, superhuman, thinking about what does all of that mean for how we shape the emerging technology in our world, and particularly how we shape AI systems. And the first thing to say here is that the capability of LLMs is improving, almost literally by the day, including on things that we as humans find pretty difficult. So this is a chart showing the improvement of LLMs on cognitive reflection tests across different models. And from here, it just goes up and up. This stops at GPT-4. And these are things like, you might all be familiar with the bat and ball problem. They're the types of problems that we tend to answer intuitively and also wrong. And actually, LLMs used to be wrong like we were, but now they are much more capable and much better. I think this kind of sets the backdrop of a dynamic where AI has the potential to augment and extend our capabilities and our cognition, but it also has the potential to replace and degrade those things as well. And it turns out that actually the design of the LLMs, and particularly the interface between a chatbot and an individual, really matter in terms of how that dynamic plays out. And these are two quick studies, and I should say at the outset, the challenge of writing this chapter is that the evidence is again moving by the day, and a lot of these studies are early stage and indicative. But these are two studies that just show, that potential difference between a coach and a crutch. And one of them was done at MIT on the left, where, and some of you may have heard of this study, it does have some methodological challenges, but it's called Your Brain on GPT. And basically the MIT students were divided into 3 groups to write essays. So one with an LLM, one with Google searches, and one unaided. And essentially the LLM group were less likely at the end to be able to quote their work. They felt a lot less ownership of it, and they showed signs of cognitive degradation. And then in contrast, kind of up the road, or rather up Massachusetts Avenue, around the same time, a study was done at Harvard with physics students who, some of them had access to in-classroom learning and teaching, and another group had access to LLMs that were closed and Socratic in style. So they were literally trying to coach them, to encourage them. They were trained on the specific knowledge that they were trying to learn and master. And in contrast to just using the LLM to offload the task, actually these students felt much higher levels of engagement and motivation, and they had roughly double the level of knowledge compared to the students who just had the classroom learning. So we can see there's some real choices here in terms of the design and the impact that is going to have on us as individuals, but also the impact it's going to have on us as a society, as economies, as organizations. But I think what we have learned from social media over the past decade is that, we shouldn't expect that to play out in a way that is good for, the collective, just by, that is not the path that we will walk with no intervention. And just to really bring that to life, this is a quote from Chris Olah, who's one of the co-founders of Anthropic. He made this quote a month ago at the launch of Pope Leo's encyclical in Vatican City, and essentially said that no matter how sincerely AI labs want to do the right thing, all of their incentives cut against doing that. And, I think it's pretty amazing and striking that they are saying this so plainly, that actually with no intervention, they will optimize for a narrow set of commercial incentives, not for what is right for humanity, not what is right for our economies as a whole. So it is up to us to shape it and to have this moral imagination and ambition about what human flourishing looks like in an age of AI. And just to give you a quick sense of what a race might look like in AI, I think many of us around the room would be able to say what's the most capable model on the market, but I doubt many of us could say what's the model on the market that is best for boosting our cognitive skills, what's the model on the market that's best for safeguarding our data and our privacy, or what's best for safeguarding our mental well-being. But those are things we should really care about, and they're things we should be measuring, they're things we should be designing incentives and races on. And this is just, an early stage of that with child safety. And again, you can see here, there's just enormous variation across the market in terms of how good these models are at safeguarding children. And this is something I think we should all be paying much more attention to. Which brings us to kind of the culmination of the book and the final question, which is that, if, as we've hopefully convinced you, we have more agency and more choice and more power really than we think we do, and we can assert that individually and collectively, actually, what are we going to choose? What kind of humans do we want to be? And in which ways do we want to be super? And some of that is about capability and intelligence, but actually a lot of it is about connection and fulfillment and flourishing. And the book is really, I think, an optimistic take on how we shape this future in a way that is good for all of us rather than a narrow set of commercial interests. So that David's going to come back on. We're going to
No, you're done. Don't worry.
Wrap it up.
Yeah. Yeah, just the last remark. Thanks.
Yeah, you take it.
Yeah. So what did you do? I mean, this actually is a plot we produced actually in the Downing Babcock recently, but looking at using the well-being data. So what are the choices we've made? I mean, partly the point, as Liz has made, is it turns out our cognition has been shaped by all kinds of decisions we made and technologies and institutions we built. And we haven't gone to that what the book is about. There's other kinds of capabilities, social capital, institutional design, and so on, which in a broad notion, we think counts of the notion of boost, how you get to be a superhuman rather than just, individually. But this is a mapping of both life satisfaction and then AI exposure. If we just leave it, as we just heard with respect to some of the big AI giants, I mean, they will pursue the primary driver. If you build a regression on this model, is there is a correlation. You can't see it very strongly, but it's there. It's actually driven by higher income jobs get hit harder. And of course, what's happening here is cognitively based jobs are being hit most harder. It doesn't mean it's all bad. It could be enhanced in certain kinds of ways. But by default, there's a drift to this, which we should be able to see. It's not obvious that we would want to get rid of some of these segments. I mean, some of this might be good with respect to augmented elites, where for many people in the room, AI will get rid of some of the crap that you don't want to do, and you'll get to keep the good stuff. And there are certain kinds of jobs down here which are relatively automatable, which, if you lose your job, you're not be at all happy about. But you might think, well, actually, that would be good to substitute. But there's a whole swathe, for example, in the middle. Sometimes, these kind of threatened creatives, where actually it's not at all obvious we want to lose those roles. So that's a kind of macro question to look alongside that. How do we want this technology to play out and affect our economies and lives? But the other, just to return to the very beginning as a kind of close, one of the things that's doing in this book is it drove me to go back and us to go back to some of the kind of core cognitive psychology. And there was this period of work in the 60s and 70s linked particularly to what are called dissonance effects. So what happens is, some psychologists nodding in the room, you must be psychologists, say dissonance effect, well trained upstairs. Essentially, you create these kind of effects where you make someone, the classic one is you get someone to do a job, and you either pay them a lot or you pay them very little to do this boring task. And then afterwards you see if they would recruit someone else and how much fun they had from it. And you find that, people make it often that involve electric shocks. This is the 1960s and 70s. Like you give these shocks to yourself and how much would you endure and so on and so on is another classic one. Anyway, I'm just saying, psychology as it was. So, but then what you do is you ask people to explain why they made the choice that they did, right? Or why did they endure the level of shock or pain or whatever it would be? And what the answer was. You get these big differentials according to how the thing was framed. But people were asked to reflect on their own account about why it occurs. And it turns out we're incredibly poor. We're incredibly poor often understanding our own, kind of the forces on our own behavior or cognition or choices. And that includes even down to sort of inspiration or even agency. And so I think an additional challenge beyond this big stuff is that we as humans, weirdly, aren't as good as we think, understanding the kind of things that are shrouded in our own minds with respect to what drives our agency. So if we want to be able to respond and shape this technology, we have to not only do it at a structural level, we actually have to reach into ourselves to understand, well, what is it that drives our own behavior and understand it? And it turns out, so it's more of a mystery than you might think. Anyway, so on that note, we should... If you haven't get it already, the book is no longer called Boost because we still wanted to be on speaking terms with our friends, Cass and Richard, as well as Ralph and Till. So we're trying to capture this notion about, it was always true for humans. We've done amazing things to be able to use tools and so on. Can we be more reflexive to shape the world we're building around us to be the best version of ourselves? And that's what we're trying to do. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I'm supposed to say, really helpful if you pre-order a few, turns out. Right, yeah. Thank you very much.
Whilst you're all busy pre-ordering,
yes,
please.
Yeah, no one's leaving until we've had a few pre-orders. That's brilliant. I've got so many questions. I'm going to start with a few. We've got a few online, but as I said, please have a think if you've got any. I hope there's someone with a microphone who can come to you when you've got a chance. Can we just go to some basics? I think that would be quite helpful. Like, how would you describe the difference between nudges and boost? They feel to me that they're either they're not opposing to each other, but they are definitely different but interlinked? Like, just give us a little sort of summary.
You want it?
Yeah,
You just
sure.
do it? Yeah.
Sure. So a nudge is any change to the environment in which we make a decision that makes a particular choice or decision easier or more likely. So they can be architectural, but they can also be much wider than that. So they can be informational. The classic example is, if you put the salad before the chips at a canteen, it's much more likely that people are going to choose the salad. But really the crucial aspect of a nudge is that it leaves freedom of choice on the table, and that people are still, open to, they can still choose the chips if they want to. Boost, in contrast, is really about strengthening an individual's capability, competence, and agency. So I think a nice way to think about it is that a nudge helps somebody make a better decision in a given moment, whereas a boost helps somebody become a better decision maker across their lives. And, some of the characteristics of boosts are that they tend to endure beyond the intervention itself. And they tend to, I think, take a view that, our minds are flexible and malleable, and actually we can grow and learn, we can build capability. And as David said, they're often seen as in opposition to one another, but actually I think from a pragmatic perspective, we think they're much better seen as on a continuum. And it's really about the extent to which you're dialing up the focus on agency, and also the focus on capability. And, I think the reason we were drawn to them and are interested in them in this current moment is that, where you have these dynamics, where you have these sophisticated choice architects designing environments that make it really difficult to choose in your own best interests, there is a big difference between having choice theoretically left on the table and actually being able to assert your own agency to choose for yourself. And that's really the dynamic that we were interested in.
And there was I think your difference between humans and superhumans sort of brings us out, but just again, say a bit more about individual agency, which is what it seems like the data is suggesting we've lost, and collective agency, which is actually where real, I think, power comes.
Yeah.
But they seem, I imagine if I was given more personal agency, my ability to then sort of negotiate with friends and sort of leave some of that on the table I might be dissuaded from doing that. That feels a bit in conflict.
We do have a chapter talking about a lot of these sort of social network effects. That the superpower of humans is our ability to work together and to coordinate, right? And if you go back to the canonical, the chips, we're all bored about, and perhaps the chips and the salad in the canteen, if we all decide we have a different view on it and try rearranging it, I mean, it's kind of carnage, right? So you do actually have a collective action problem which you have to solve. And there's lots of arguments, I versus S, etc. Arguably, we are drawn to look at the individual variable, but often we've underrated, we tend to underplay the collective. But even if you take the example of the One Set app, right? It's actually, not only is it operating at the individual level with respect to it helps you, but it actually changes the market. Because I now have to produce a product that Liz is going to prepare to wait 10 seconds for and still use, which you might think is a trivial matter, but it turns out that's really different, right? Because in that 10 seconds, when I'm now thinking about it, it's like, well, I could do all these other things. I could talk to my partner, or I could, call my mother or whatever, So is it still worth it? It actually changes the market pressure. So it's operating both on the individual and the collective level. And also, of course, coming back to the canteen, in the end, it's not something some of these things you can coordinate, but you have to choose together. You can move enough consumers, or you need some kind of mechanisms. So we talk a lot about what are the collective or governance mechanisms that you can use to decide this. So we love nudges, we love behavioral science, the whole area, but it's like there is something beyond leaving choice on the table, because there was always a question of, well, who designed that choice architecture, which looks like it's a collective thing generally as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions that came in before, and it did strike me that this was a particularly, maybe it's in the book, but when there are choice architecture challenges, for example, giving ratings to the most, age-friendly LLM or whatever, or indeed the example of like which is the best social network for young people. There's a third party that has to provide that information. Now, the question that came in was like, are we just relying upon commercially motivated big tech companies to build that in. That seems unlikely. Is it just regulation? Is it just a legislative thing? Or is there actually a role for third-party actors here to provide, and is that ever going to be provided by the market? Like, what's the sort of the missing link here?
Well, I mean, I think definitely there's a role for third parties. So, actually it's kind of a live debate in terms of how regulators around the world use transparency measures, and a lot of them have powers to compel some of this information to be provided from tech companies, but also from other regulated companies as well, be they energy companies or whatever it might be. And often, regulators are a bit reluctant to publish it in such a stark way in a league table or a comparison, not least because of the challenges around litigation. But if they collect that data and put it in a machine-readable format and publish it in a way that can be used by civil society, can be used by, parent groups or safety lobbies or, anybody really, I think that there's this vibrant space where actually that can, that can come to the fore.
Transparency, as always, might be, or knowing what data to collect and how to publish it feels like a much more powerful tool than sometimes we.
Yeah, one of the.
Well, exactly.
I mean, we actually supposed to spend a fair amount of time in regulators. I'm Competition Markets Authority say as well. But there's a very kind of familiar. Well, if you're a regulator, you think about these the pyramid of intervention, which kind of moves from persuasion. That sounds familiar. To other kind of tougher interventions, civil interventions, criminal interventions, suspensions. We're literally going to shut you down type thing. Interesting, it tends to be focused on bads, but there's always a kind of a mirror. Some might remember talking about this in BIT. There's a mirror side of it, which is what are the goods you're also trying to promote, where you might want to, encourage good behavior or good products, and you move through it. And in fact, the pinnacle of it, which is a great Nesta type space actually, is where there's an absent thing, which is a facilitating structure or activity. So the example from years ago now, from Royal Society of Public Health, that was done by a charity. It wasn't done by government. Government could have drumbeat that, but sometimes you have to facilitate. I mean, a very simple current example on the CMA side actually would be fuel checker. I mean, there have been discussions on and off for years, and we did it with Victor Dominello in Australia. But it took a very long time for that to happen. It actually required some regulatory action to release the data to make it possible. But then it's up for the community to use it, everyone as consumers, and then it has to change the market. So it's a combination of those things. So sometimes redesigning that architecture is a key part of it, and there's, well, do we act as activists? You can sometimes push for that missing piece of the puzzle. It does often require government. I mean, government is a key part of solving collective action problems, which we then can use as a tool to change.
I'll carry on, but otherwise, anyone in the room? Yes, you with the black T-shirt. Can you just say who you are and where you're from, just for everyone online?
Will Moy from the Campbell Collaboration. I have the pleasure of working with Liz on an advisory group. I love the idea of MPs having to spin their phones around 3 times before they change Prime Minister. And I actually wondered if you could take this into the democratic and the political space for a second, because when you were talking about agency, I was thinking back to the great deal of research there is on political efficacy. If I get involved in my local area, if I get involved in my country, can I make a difference? That kind of question. Don't expect you to have memorized the data off the top of your heads, but do you see a read across from the thinking you're doing to the democratic space, and what does that look like?
Yeah, very much so. So there's a chapter basically about community and so on. A lot of these informal institutions that operate that enable us to solve collective action problems, as in social capital literature, that itself is foundational to the function of our institutions too, making democracy work, 1993. Then how do you then improve your institutions as well? I think we've had a house view, and Liz and I have written on previously actually about, we think regulators and governments could do more on the governance side themselves, where you inject a requirement to enable, like, the parameters of your platform, whatever it will be, to be designed by the users. Of course, B-Bound Kidron, which we were both at dinner last night, just her book has come out this week. A good plug for it on users. Very much pivotal about this sort of space, about how can you alter that dynamic. So that is, political institutions, and big fans of the sort of whole, the shackled Leviathan arguments. As you strengthen governments or indeed corporations, and we sort of need it. Like we don't want to have and live with that level of choice in many domains. It's just too much for us. So we do want choice engines and intermediaries to work on our behalf, and imbuing them power. But at the same time, then how do we strengthen the shackles, the corresponding shackles, so that they're actually working on our behalf rather than having gone off sideways. So Liz talked about this. I think one of the tilts we take from it is to shift from certainly individual level accounts of boost into saying exactly what does it mean at societal or collective levels, right? That has got to be part of the story as well, whether it's I do love your spin your phone 3 times, but yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, you with the tie.
Oh God, that classification is very hard.
Apologies.
I
Hot
listened.
day.
David, I know. Michael told me before how I'm putting on the tie. Great stuff. I mean,
So
I'm
can you
really
introduce
happy.
yourself? Just
Oh,
so
sorry.
everyone
Yes, Sunshine Banerjee from King's College London. It's great to see the book has been renamed. I mean, it's now sort of more in the public domain. I think a few years ago when Till and I wrote the academic piece on calling for more agency, there was a time when the I-frame, S-frame was coming out, and many people started questioning, why are you calling for more agency? I just wanted to pick your interest, being deliberately cheeky now, when a huge part of behavioral science community is actually asking for more system level coercive style stuff.
Yeah.
What makes you sort of think agency is necessary? Also because it's going to give me a good answer, because another great book I think is coming out called Nudge Plus, and I think it's also about agency.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sadly, we can't pre-order it here, but I'm sure it'll be excellent. And it's just a competition, I'm going to mention it.
Oh, you lead.
Well, I guess, Sanchian, I'd sort of challenge some of the premise of the question of, do we really think system level interventions need to be coercive? I don't think they do. And I think there's lots of ways that we can do it. And a lot of what we talk about in the second part of the book is about how we do system level work in a way that does assert collective agency, and that, from everything from the work we did with Meta on community forums of like, how do you literally give a voice to the users of a platform so that they can shape the nature and character of it? That doesn't feel coercive. It feels like people shaping it. I don't know if you want to say more about exactly what you mean, but
well, Nudge Plus, so we do flag Nudge Plus. For those who don't know it, it's a very interesting idea with Peter, John and others. So it's again trying to explore that intermediate space. So I think that is an important area. So a number of us are wrestling with that. Look, we are going to want, and Cass often talks about, sometimes you're going to want to choose not to choose. It's just too much out there, etc. So it's quite a complex issue to say, when do you dial up the agency and the choice and kick it in? And now, of course, in a world of AI, sometimes you think of it as a system 3 being in operation, that becomes quite a profound question about how we shape it. As I said, it does also, it feels to us writing this, it's interesting, is a bit the zeitgeist is there. People are wrestling with these questions on multiple fronts, because, as I tried to say at the beginning really, but people's expectation of choice has really shifted very dramatically over recent lifetimes, as well as the world around us. And yet there's like the gears are somehow grinding against, because of the sort of fractionation of, Liz talked about attention, but it would also be sense making, about your actual action, sort of being hacked in these various levels. So you can do it at the individual level, but in the end, if you're going to win it, you also have to move upstream system level. I think we've always, I think, made that argument, and others in the room hopefully would recognize that. I don't know if we've always landed it sufficiently on that side of the equation. So we're trying to do.
One of the questions online, actually, I think builds on this. It's from Kathy Mungle-Baldwin. Said, how does this work apply to critical societal behavioural needs in low resource settings, like adopt health-seeking behaviours or adopting pro-environmental behaviours? Outside of the sort of very well-funded commercial social media context or AI context, any very specific examples you came across, or things you'd like to highlight?
Do you want to talk about becoming a man? And so we have
that is a big question.
Bit personal, but
well, go ahead.
Maybe Philip.
Sorry. So for the purposes of trying to convey the argument in 20, 30 minutes, we focused on tech examples tonight. Actually, the book is very wide-ranging in terms of the types of examples and policy areas and settings we talk about. And actually, a lot of the work we draw on is the work from the Chicago Crime Lab, and actually the work Tom's leading with the Ending Youth Violence Lab, which is looking at how to build metacognitive skills in young people who are at risk of violence and reoffending. and really trying to teach them how to engage their system too in moments where, you know, they're in conflict and distress, and where the instinctive thing is to fight and to, you know, to really make decisions that are not in their best interests, and how can you slow down that thinking and get them to think about the range of options ahead of them. And, you know, that's mainly been done in that kind of youth violence setting, but actually there's really broad application beyond that in terms of how we build those metacognitive skills, you know, across our lives, and also really important how we build them in the context of AI as well.
Yeah, the timing is brilliant in terms of the uptick in frontier models. We've got time for one more question, if anyone, very patiently at the back.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I'm Philip Tamer. I'm a Sunshine's PhD candidate, and I'm doing my PhD on the interplay between agency and policy effectiveness. So very nice to see this in the book. So I just quickly wanted to relate to your point before on choosing to choose and choosing not to choose. So I find this concept of second-order agency very, very interesting, and it hasn't been, it's fairly new to the literature itself. And I wanted to ask to what extent we can incorporate this view into active intervention design. And also what's quite interesting, I mean, one would suspect that second-order agency or the susceptibility to it relates also to social demographic factors and also other similar factors. So to what extent does then kind of make the, does this second-order agency make those people kind of who want to choose or want to choose not to choose very vulnerable in a sense? So to what extent should we then incorporate the protection of those that do not want to choose in a sense into the design of interventions?
Yeah. Look, Liz used the example of financial behavior, which we spent a long time actually going back through that literature, and it's a very strong one, I think, on this around, because you sort of see that already, right? If you go to a financial advisor, they ought to ask you some questions which sort of set up your preferences about what you want to know about or what you don't, or just leave me alone type thing. And so that's a sort of crude version of it. That should now be possible in many domains where you might want to say, you know, and it becomes crucially, especially in a world where you now have another set of agents which are acting, and on whose behalf are they, and when will they step in and when will they not, right? I mean, we've got used to the idea of when you had kids and parents who are doing some of that kind of, but that's going to be around us in a much more profound way. So to what extent will you shape it? Will it learn your preferences, and will it actually reflect? And you'll face a lot of the same questions we always did in other domains, which is, you know, well, to what extent do you override if you're going to do something, you know, dumb or not? But the idea that you should have set those parameters, and it will step in accordingly. That's why it's often referred to as a sort of system 3 with those elements. And do we get to train it or not? But you might want to add other examples.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. If you'll join me by thanking David and Liz, and buy the book.
Thank you.